Hello friends and welcome back. Today I'm turning candy molds into slip cast molds. To start with, you're going to need a good particulate filter to work with the pottery plaster, as well as something you want to make a mold of, a scale, the ability to weigh out your plaster and sieve it, as well as some mold making release depending on what you're using. For the silicone candy molds, I don't usually use a mold release, but if you want to use something that is more absorbent than silicone, you would use a half and half mixture of Murphy's oil soap and water mixed together. So to start with, in order to ensure that my candy mold doesn't float up underneath the plaster once it's poured in, I fill the negative spaces with plaster so that it will stay weighted down. I put that onto a slab of clay inside a bucket that's approximately the size of the mold that I want to make. And then I'm going to sieve my dry plaster into a separate container that's clean and dry that I can weigh out the plaster that I need. From there, I'm going to dump all of my water into a larger bucket. And then I'm going to add the sieved plaster into the water a little bit at a time. And I'm going to let it sit for a total of 3 minutes so that it can slake down. And then I'm going to mix it together. First by gently stirring, and then I'm going to put my hand inside the plaster and just kind of swirl my hand around and feel for any lumps or clumps that need to get incorporated into the liquid. It's really important to let your plaster sit and slake down for no more than 3 minutes, otherwise it will begin to set up and you'll have a hard, crusty ball of plaster with powder on the inside, and none of it will be usable. While that timer is counting down, I'm going to set my area up so that I can start putting the plaster into the molds that I'm going to use, because once it's mixed, it's going to set fairly quickly, and you won't have a lot of time to do any of that. Once you want to start pouring your plaster. Another really important thing to keep in mind is that plaster will harden in water, so under no circumstances whatsoever do you want to rinse any of your plaster mixing containers or tools off in a sink unless you feel like filling up your pipes with hardened plaster. So it's a really good idea to have a bucket of water off to the side that you can rinse your hands, your tools, and any other things that come into contact with the plaster while it's wet. And then once you've rinsed that and it's sat for about 10 minutes, you can drain the clear water off and properly dispose of the plaster into a trash container. So my timer has just gone off now, and I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, rinse my equipment and my hand, and then I'm going to grab a large bold pipette to just fill in some of the negative areas around the back side of this mold that I want to turn into a slip casting mold. It's really important to do this and get plaster into all the little cracks and crevices so that when you remove the plaster from the silicone, you don't have air pockets that will give you messy slip cast products. I like to get my silicone molds from local hobby and craft stores, but you can also do a search online to buy them from an ethical shop like Amazon. Just kidding. Amazon's not ethical, but you can still buy candy molds from them. I won't judge you. So once I've filled in all the negative space in the tiny cracks and crevices with plaster, I'm just going in with a bigger scoop to fill in the bulk of this plaster mold. And as I'm going, I'm just giving a little wiggle and jiggle and a bounce against the table to start knocking some of those air pockets out. You can see as I'm pouring this plaster in that it's already starting to set up and get a little bit thick because it's not pouring in like a smooth liquid. Once I'm happy with the depth of the plaster in the bucket, I'm just going to tap it on all the different sides, and then I'm going to pick it up and give it a couple gentle drops to get as much air out of that mold as I possibly can. Now that I have mixed up extra plaster, which was the plan all along, I'm taking that bulb syringe again and I'm just filling in these gummy bear molds with plaster so that I can turn this into slip cast molds to turn into beads and trinkets to give away at my local food pantry. Every time I run a load through the kiln, I try to throw in a couple small pieces that I can donate to the food pantry because they're always looking for fun things to give to the kids. If you're going to do something similar, it's really important to make sure that the pieces you make are either too big to be swallowed or you have put holes in them so that if they do go into a child's mouth, they don't get lodged in the airway and cause a choking problem. So far, that hasn't been a problem for me. So now I'm just taking my leftover plaster that I have and I'm putting it into these disposable takeaway containers that I had in the kitchen. And I'm going to be putting small stoppered bottles into this plaster in order to make some more little trinkets to give away in the future. Throughout this entire process, I have kept my filtration mask on. It's really important that you have a P100 particulate air filter when you are working with dry plaster because it does harden when it comes into contact with moisture, and the air in our lungs is very moist and the plaster dust is very fine. I usually don't take off my air filter until I'm completely done with the process, mostly just because once the plaster is mixed, I'm thinking more about what I'm doing and the next step in my process rather than thinking about taking my mask off. But once you're done working with dry plaster, if you want to take your mask off, that would be a good time to do it. So what I'm doing here is taking these little glass bottles that have been swirling around in a cup of Murphy's oil soap and water, and I'm just pushing them into the slightly thickened plaster about halfway. I don't want to go more than halfway because then I won't be able to remove them out of the plaster when I'm done. And that is the end of part 1 of my slip casting candy mold making tutorial. I hope that you were able to learn something or enjoy yourself. And if you listen closely, you can probably hear my kiln ticking on and off in the background, as well as our well pump running for a load of laundry. I do work out of my basement and it's not always a perfectly quiet place. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope that you have a great day. And leave a comment if you learned something from this tutorial today.